Hey, so I'm going to be sharing today with you guys about the importance of prayer. Not necessarily how to pray or when or how often or anything like that, but I just want to get a conversation going about how vital, how crucial prayer is at the center of our lives as followers of Christ. So I'm going to begin just by sharing this passage, which we're going to sort of draw on for this next little while. And it's Matthew 18. It says, "At this time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And he called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, 'I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" So, I don't know if you can tell from my accent, but I'm kind of fairly new to Canada, just been here for a couple of years. Came over to get married to a beautiful young Canadian woman named Heather, and very happily married. But I've taken on a role at church as a youth pastor. And so, new to Canada, as a youth pastor, trying to build connections with the kids, however I can. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is kind of get into some of the North American sports for the first time. And for some reason, the sort of sport that stuck with me has been basketball. So I've kind of been getting into the NBA. And one of my clearest observations from just kind of getting into it initially is this question, who is the greatest? Seems to come up all the time. Who's the greatest player right now? Who's the greatest player of all time? In a sport that's driven by the star player, seems to just be a constant source of conversation. So Michael Jordan turned 50 years old recently, and they interviewed him, and they were talking about, this was like the main conversation. Who's the greatest right now? Who's the greatest player? And it was very controversial. All kinds of discussion was sparked from it, and it's like, man, this guy turns 50, and instead of talking about him and his career, it's like, it's this question, who is the greatest? Just coming up again and again. And it's amazing how in all areas of life this question is so pervasive, whether it be sports or entertainment or business. We're constantly sort of comparing those who excel in their field and saying, man, who really is the best? Who's the greatest? And on a more personal, on a deeper level, I think this is a question that touches all of our lives to some degree. We all want to feel like we have a significant contribution, that there is some area in which we're able to achieve, able to excel, able to do well in, able to be great. And here we have, even amongst the 12 disciples who've been walking with Jesus, for 17 chapters here, this question crops up again. Who is the greatest in the kingdom? Who's the greatest? Now, this is one of these times where I'm sort of tempted to judge the disciples. Come on guys, one chapter ago, Jesus is literally taking out a demon from a boy, by the power of his word, and here you are the next day saying, who's the great, why does it matter? You know what I'm saying? You're in the presence of Jesus Christ. But it's amazing actually how these last couple of years have entered into the whole sort of church world and hanging around with a lot of sort of church leaders and behind the scenes on how churches are run. I kind of see this question cropping up again and again within that church leadership world. It's like, working for church initially, I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. Everyone's going to be sort of sitting around praying, doing Bible study. Everyone's going to be happy, chirpy. We're in the house of God. Let's just relax. But instead, it's like, man, people are working so hard in this place. It's like people aren't praying. They are like task, do, working long hours. I'm like, guys, let's just chill out a little bit. But everyone is, man, wanting to excel, wanting to achieve, wanting to do their best. I think, whether it's this burden of church leadership where people feel like they're representing God, or, one of the challenges is, athletes can count their medals and their trophies, and businesswomen can count their money. But what counts in the kingdom? I think this is what the disciples are getting at. And a lot of church leaders think about it. It's like, how do I know I'm doing well? How do I know I'm doing a good job? And so, we look at attendance and doing big events and how many people we baptize and how many people have come to Christ. And if we're not careful, this whole thing can be us trying to clutch at success, clutch at achievement. This question, who is the greatest, could permeate what we're doing. And actually what Christ says when they ask this question is, look at this little child. Unless you change and become like him, unless you humble yourself, you won't even enter the kingdom. Now, what is it about a little child? What is it about the humility of a little boy here that Jesus is getting at, that Jesus is leading us, that Jesus is trying to teach us? I'd just like to reflect with you for the remainder of this little talk about that. So this has been a time in my life where I've actually been hanging out with kids a lot more recently. I had a time, back in the day I used to hang out with kids a lot, when I was a kid. And then I sort of had this break where none of my friends really had younger siblings, and I wasn't doing like playgroup or Sunday school ministry, and it's not one of these kind of things where you can just kind of go to a park and start making friends. It's when parents kind of get edgy and uptight, and so I just had this sort of breather from hanging out with kids. And now I'm back working for a church. Some of my friends are starting to get married and have babies, things like this, and so I'm like hanging out with kids all the time, I'm finding. And it's amazing how I feel like God is trying to save me. He's trying to speak to me through my interactions with children. And so I'd like to just tell you about one sort of significant time recently. At church, we had this very sort of big Christmas Eve production, this last Christmas Eve. And it was like, 4 services and big lights and music and stage, and my role was sort of to be the host. And so I had these cues and I had these lines, and I was wearing a fancy suit, and I was kind of nervous about it. And so one of these segments was actually a kid's segment. So I had a bunch of kids come onto the stage, and they weren't prepped, they weren't scripted, and I would just ask them simple questions about Christmas, like, how many sheep, like, what are you excited about Christmas? How many sheep were there in the narrative, etc. Okay, just silly questions, and the kids would just, say something, and it'd be funny, and everyone loved it. But we're doing 4 services, so this was like all day, and I had to kind of keep these kids under control backstage so they wouldn't just run off into the crowd or whatever. And so I was hanging out with the kids, and as I observed them, as I hung out with them, I was just amazed at what I saw. Because I was there kind of uptight backstage. I had my wife's family coming. It was like, usually I just work with the high school students, it's like the whole church, didn't want to screw up. And I was kind of nervous, but these kids, they weren't nervous at all. They spent most of their time, honestly, either dancing or laughing. If there was a song, they'd sort of dance around to it. And even if there wasn't, it seemed to just sort of jump up and down to the song in their head. And they would freely laugh. I was like, what are you guys laughing about? We've got to go on in 5 minutes. And they're just totally chilled out, totally relaxed. And just in awe of everything. I mean, how you kind of grow up and everything becomes boring. It's like, I get it. There's a chair, there's a table, there's a floor, whatever. There's a person, there's a tree. These kids, like, some of them have only been in the world for 4 years, and everything's a miracle. They're like staring at this light bulb, it's like in amazement. I was like looking at these kids like, how are you so alive? How are you so free? I couldn't get my head around it. And the amazing thing was, I was backstage thinking over, am I going to do well? Am I going to be noticed? Am I going to be funny? Am I going to succeed? And I was so uptight. And yet these kids, just with their their natural beauty, their natural innocence, their natural charm, walked onto that stage and were so much more captivating than I could have ever been, with my polished lines and fancy suit. And so as I was there thinking about all this, I felt God speaking to me and saying, if you're constantly worried about this question of greatness, of achieving, of being noticed, of being seen, then pretty soon all of life becomes a stage. And you're only really living for the applause. You're only really living to be noticed. But yet the word of Jesus Christ to his disciples is, unless you change and become like a little child, you'll never even enter the kingdom. You'll never even enter into the life of freedom and joy and dancing and celebrating that I have for you. And there was just one more picture that from that whole day about what it is to be a child completely humble before God, to enter into his kingdom, that I just want to share with you. And at the end of the day, everything was wrapping up, and there was this one little girl named Natalie, 5 years old, little beautiful Chinese girl. And she was there the whole day. She was there for all 4 services. And so she was kind of shy with me at the beginning, but by the end of it, we were like best friends, And right at the end, she'd had a great time. She'd said some hilarious responses. some of the questions. Everyone was loving her. And so she was backstage at the end, just so overwhelmed with excitement and joy. And she was like jumping down the spot. And I remember her saying, you know, it's Christmas tomorrow, just going crazy. And there was this one moment where she just started running up to me, just running, tiny little thing. And she got right up close to me, and she just lifted up her hands as high as she could and got right on her tiptoes. And for a moment, I didn't know what was going on, and then I realized she wants to be held. She wants me to pick her up and hold her. And so I bent down, and I picked her up in my arms, and I wrapped my arms around her. And as soon as I did, her whole body just was at peace. And her little head just nestled into my shoulder. And that was what broke me. That was the thing that exposed me. Because it was her ability to love so freely, so easily. Her ability to be held. Her desire to reach up her arms and be completely dependent on someone bigger than her, someone stronger than her. And I realized my own inability, my own lack of desire to be held by God, to be carried by God. You know, sometimes we fall into this trap of wanting to do things on our own strength, to wanting to have a plan, have a strategy, have a leadership principle, and do it. But I believe the Word of God here, as He calls us to be like children, is this picture of arms in the air, bowed low, just in total dependence, total prayer. And I believe this is what Jesus said, and it's what He actually modeled. You know, throughout His life, throughout His ministry, He is this man, He's this picture of strength as He goes about, you know, healing, casting out demons, preaching. And yet in the midst of that, He's constantly returning to this place of solitude, this place of prayer, to return to be completely dependent on His Father. That's the foundation of His whole ministry, is to remember to identify Himself as a son, as a child of the King. What if our churches weren't built on, you know, the greatest worship, the greatest music, teaching, the greatest youth work, childcare, coffee, seats, whatever it is? What if it wasn't all based on a great strategy, a great evangelism technique, a 5-year plan? What about at the center of our churches was just a group of women and men who were completely committed to being down on their knees, hands reached in the air, just completely dependent on God? What if our greatest desire, rather than to be great, was to be held, to be carried by God, to be with the one who says, "You're my son, you're my daughter"? I believe that's what Jesus is calling us to here.